we're pretty far from having a proper scientific understanding of consciousness in the general case. I'm not committed to the fundamental permanent irresolvability of what's sometimes called the hard problem of how consciousness could relate to or arise from material stuff. At best, it's in the long-term future. So an alternative would be panpsychism. That's the view that everything is conscious. So there are kind of two versions of panpsychism that are relevant to the consciousness of the United States. There's a kind of panpsychism that says, well, everything is conscious, therefore the United States is also conscious. Luke Roelofs, for example, has defended that, although they think that the level of consciousness of the United States might be kind of low and fuzzy. Another kind of panpsychism, however, ends up in the same kind of problem, let's call it, that materialists have, right? So some panpsychists will say, I think Philip Goff is among them, that, well, yes, look, fundamental particles are conscious. Consciousness is ubiquitous. And humans and a lot of animals are conscious. But not just any aggregate of stuff is conscious. Like a stone is not conscious, right? So then they need to figure out how to draw the line between the conscious collections of things, like humans, and the non-conscious collections of things, like stones, or like arbitrary objects, like your shoe and the rings of Saturn. And then they need to face the question of whether the United States is of the first type or the second type. And then the kinds of things that they'll tend to appeal to make that distinction might end up looking pretty similar to the kinds of things that materialists appeal to. So that kind of alternative to mainstream scientific materialism, unless you go the kind of Roelofs path and just think like every aggregate is conscious, ends up with a lot of the same kinds of issues that you get with the materialist case.
It's interesting that it feels like those kind of trade-offs of like, yeah, you can go down one route like panpsychism rather than materialism, but like at a certain point you hit a wall of like, oh wait, we still have to define what kind of thing consciousness is. Okay, we can assume, like, make some assumption that's like in things, but then again you still face like criteria of, okay, but what kind of thing is consciousness? And again it gets to the question of, well, that you can make the metaphysical assumption, but what kind of thing is it? What do you think there's value in considering such wide alternatives, or what do you think is the most plausible?
Absolutely.
And you think there could be evidence accumulated to that in the future where, oh no, we think that idealism rather than materialism is more likely to be true,
Yeah. So I think both of those things, and let me tie this into the thesis of my 2024 book, The Weirdness of the World. So in that book, what I argue is that every viable philosophical and scientific theory of the nature of consciousness and of the nature of the cosmos is both bizarre and dubious. Bizarre in the sense that it has some implications that sharply conflict with common sense, and dubious in the sense that we're not epistemically compelled by the evidence to believe it to be true. So what we end up with, I think, whenever we get into, let's just stick with consciousness, whenever we get into foundational questions of consciousness, is choice among a variety of views, all of which have some pretty bizarre seeming weird consequences, and none of which we can just put a stake in and say, this one's definitely right. So I think the task, or one of the tasks, of theories of consciousness is to explore the range of alternatives and say, okay, well, look, here's one approach, and here are the pros and the cons, and here's where these are the bizarre implications it has. Bizarre implications don't necessarily mean it's false. Every theory has bizarre implications, but let's own up to the ones that this theory has, right? And now let's look at some others, and now let's look at some others, and now let's look at some others. And one of the things I think people do when they first react to some like panpsychism and idealism. Idealism is the view, or one kind of idealism is the view that only minds exist, material stuff doesn't exist independently of minds at all. One thing people, well, they react to that by saying, wow, that's too bizarre to be true. But part of the point of exploring the bizarre implications of mainstream theories of consciousness is to say, well, look, every view kind of seems too bizarre to be true, but something must be true. So the mere fact that panpsychism or idealism strongly violates common sense is not by itself sufficient grounds for rejecting that.
You can find the full podcast that I did with Eric down in the description. We talk about topics like consciousness and AI in groups and just in general theories of consciousness. And subscribe for more content like this on topics like AI, consciousness, whatever else I find interesting. Thank you.